Walt Disney Animation Studios. They have been the face of feature animation for quite some time. When people think of animated movies, Disney is most likely the first to come to mind. And why shouldn't it? They've been making feature-length animated films for nearly a century. It hasn't always been easy for them, though. Walt Disney Animation has hit a few bumps in the road, nearly failing completely at some points, but they always come back. And nowadays, it seems like they're too big to fail thanks to how massive the Walt Disney Company is. But this video series isn't about the entirety of Disney, it's about Walt Disney Animation Studios and their films. In each video, I will go over a period of time in the films released during that time, mainly focusing on the films. I will do my best to go over some of the important aspects of the production, as well as my own personal opinion on each movie. These videos are separated by the Disney eras, an unofficial categorization of the films in a chronological order. There is no right or wrong way to categorize them. This is just how I determined to do it by researching others. The Disney eras will encompass everything from Snow White to Moana by the end of this series. So let's start with the first era, the Golden Age. The Golden Age consists of 5 films from 1937 to 1942. It's a very short era compared to later ones, but there is a lot that happened during the production of these films. There's the first full-length animated film that Disney produced, which is pretty important. There was the start of World War II that affected a lot of the finances behind the scenes, and there was even a strike. These films may seem a little old-fashioned nowadays, but I can't help but love the artistry in them. There's a lot to appreciate with these animated films, so let's learn about them, beginning with the one that started them all. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White is frequently credited as the first full-length animated feature, but it's actually the first full-length cell animated feature. There were a few animated movies before Snow White using different techniques. Snow White was quite the endeavor for Walt Disney. He ended up mortgaging his house to help fund the film since it was 10 times the budget of one of Disney's Silly Symphony shorts at $250,000. And the budget eventually became even more at nearly $1.5 million. It may not seem like a lot to movies now, but back in the 1930s, it was a lot. Disney's brother and wife tried to talk him out of making the movie, but he was determined to keep production going. Since this was the first full-length animated film for Disney, the animators needed a bit more experience to get the project done. One of the animators, Art Babbitt, held a class sort of like a study group at his house for his fellow animators. But then Disney offered to provide space and supplies at the studio. Then an animator named Hardy Gramatke suggested recruiting Don Graham to help teach them. From what I've read, it seems like the animators were really enthralled with their work, and enthusiastic about getting better and improving to make sure they made the best thing they could produce. There's a lot more I could go into about the individual animators of the time, but there's a lot of movies to cover in this series. I just wanted to point all that out since this is the first film. Before Snow White released, there were a lot of people that doubted the film. But after its premiere on December 21st, 1937 at the Carthy Circle Theater, it received a standing ovation. Walt Disney received an honorary award at the 11th Academy Awards, which included 1 full-sized Oscar and 7 miniature ones representing the dwarves. It was also quite the financial success. Snow White ended up earning over $7.8 million worldwide by the end of its original run. This allowed Disney to move ahead with more animated films, but we'll get to those soon. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs opens up with credits that includes a thank you note from Walt Disney himself. I imagine it was something he was extremely thankful for, being the first film and him mortgaging his house for it. There's a lot of tropes in Snow White that were established. There's the classic book opening and closing, which would be a motif in future films. It's a very old-fashioned fairy tale with a prince, princess, love's first kiss, friendly animals to the main character, etc. It's a story that could be told in 10 minutes that's stretched to an hour and a half, something that Disney would be good at doing. There's a few animation techniques used in Snow White that would give it a very unique look, such as using a multi-plane camera for the foreground and background to give scenes a bit of depth. There was also a bit of rotoscoping used with Snow White herself. It's a technique that would mainly be used on humans. Apparently, a lot of the animators oppose the use of rotoscoping, and I learned that none of Art Babbitt's animation was rotoscoped. The story structure is very odd for these older animated movies. It's really more about appreciating the animation when watching than the story. There's a lot more rhyming than I remember, not just in the songs, but the dialogue too. Speaking of the songs, there's a few, and of course there's Hi Ho, which was my favorite as a kid. The other songs are fine, though very old-fashioned. The main character of Snow White is a bit dull. The real stars are the dwarves, which makes sense because most of the movie is with them. The queen as the villain is pretty brutal. Like, she orders the huntsman to kill Snow White and bring back her heart. That's some Game of Thrones shit. Her transformation into the old hag is also pretty metal. Snow White was the first, but it definitely isn't my favorite. I just appreciate it for what it did for Disney in animation. Pinocchio. So during the production of Snow White, one of the animators, Norman Ferguson, brought a translated version of the adventures of Pinocchio. Walt Disney was excited by this story, and wanted to make it a movie. Pinocchio was actually meant to be the third film after Bambi, but Bambi was put on hold due to difficulties. More on that later. Being based on a novel, Pinocchio had to go through many drastic changes in the story, which Disney would become infamous for doing with their adaptations. In the original design for Pinocchio, Walt felt that no one could sympathize with the character. After a redesign and personality makeover, Walt then felt Pinocchio was too helpless. So they introduced Jiminy Cricket, which in the original novel was just a cricket that Pinocchio killed with a mallet that would return as a ghost. Pinocchio ended up costing twice as much as Snow White, but it wasn't a success at the box office, and apparently it had a disastrous premiere. It led to Walt Disney becoming very depressed about the initial box office returns. It didn't help that World War II cut off the European and Asian markets, so it hindered any sort of international success for Disney's films in this era past Snow White. Despite having little box office success, the effects animation in Pinocchio were groundbreaking for the time. It was praised for its use of water and how the splashes were kept impressionistic. It also had a lot more moving parts and more detailed backgrounds compared to Snow White. Pinocchio also introduced the iconic theme for the company with the song When You Wish Upon a Star. Pinocchio as a character is very gullible and naive, which is kind of the point, but I think that Jiminy Cricket is kind of at fault in the beginning here. He's late for his first day of his job as Pinocchio's conscience. Geppetto isn't exactly innocent here. He's letting his boy that just came to life go out on his own. He could at least walk him to school so that he didn't end up running into Honest John and Gideon. Despite having drastic differences from the book, Pinocchio still remains to be one of the darker Disney films. It really starts getting darker once he's kidnapped by Stromboli. And I think a lot of people remember the Pleasure Island scene with the boys turning into donkeys. It's never resolved either, it's just something that happens in this world. Then there's the whole sequence in the ocean with Monstro. The animation looks fantastic. I remember this being my favorite part of the movie as a kid. And my least favorite part of Kingdom Hearts. When rewatching, I completely forgot about Cleo and Figaro. I gotta say Figaro is one super cute cat character, and very detailed with his coloring. That's something that these Golden Age films have a lot of, detail in the coloring of the characters. Pinocchio is a film that I watched a lot of as a kid, but haven't revisited it until now, and I'm glad I did, because it's fantastically animated and a wild ride. Fantasia. Walt Disney felt that Mickey needed a boost in popularity, so the idea for the Sorcerer's Apprentice short was born. Walt met up with Leopold Stokowski at a restaurant and he offered to conduct for the short at no cost. Originally, the project was just going to be The Sorcerer's Apprentice, but Walt's brother Roy said it would never recover the cost with just one short. Then came the idea to produce it as a complete feature film, initially titled The Concert Feature. They contacted Deems Taylor about being an on-screen host for the film to directly address the audience and tie together each short. Fantasia became the first commercial film to have stereo sound, called Fantasound then. Disney was focusing on a greater importance on music. Walt said, "In our ordinary stuff, our music is always under action, but on this, we're supposed to be picturing the music, not the music fitting our story." He hoped the film would bring classical music to people who, like him, would previously walk out on it. It was first released as a theatrical roadshow across 13 different US cities, with it premiering first in New York City. It ended up playing there for over a year. Over 1,000 artists and technicians worked on Fantasia, but it ended up being an even greater loss than Pinocchio. Fantasound actually ended up hurting Fantasia's profit due to how long it took to set up, taking a theater's personnel a week working to install it, costing $85,000 with each setup. Not to mention Disney having to lease the theaters for this special roadshow. RKO was handling the re-release of Fantasia, but wanted the film to be cut down. Disney fought that decision, but eventually gave in. Fantasia didn't make a profit until 1969, 3 years after Walt Disney's death. Since Fantasia is so different from the other films, I'm going to briefly go over the shorts one by one after talking about the framing device. It starts out with the orchestra being set up and Deems Taylor introducing the audience to a new form of entertainment. As a kid, I remember fast-forwarding through parts that I thought were a bit boring, like the introduction and the first segment, which is very abstract. I can appreciate it a bit more now, though. The second segment is with the Nutcracker Suite, and there's a lot more fantasy element here with the fairies, but also just nature. It's very pretty. The third one is the whole reason this came to be and the face of the movie, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's still enjoyable to watch to this day. The fourth is The Rite of Spring, showing Earth's beginning and then the triumph and demise of the dinosaurs. I bet you couldn't guess that this was my favorite segment as a kid. It's super inaccurate now, but it's still fun, and it's got some really great lava and earthquake effects. Then there is an intermission, which is strange because it's only a 2-hour movie. Most movies are around 2 hours. Usually I only see intermissions in older movies that are longer than 3 hours. I suppose it's because it's similar to seeing an orchestra play live, so they put an intermission in the middle. After coming back, Deems Taylor has this little segment with the soundtrack, which is cute, I guess. Then we have the Pastoral Symphony, which explores some Greek mythology. It has a lot of cute antics with mythical creatures like unicorns, pegasi, and centaurs, and then Zeus comes in and seems to ruin their fun for no reason. This is one segment that actually had a character edited out because it was a racist depiction. If you look it up, you'll know exactly why it was edited. Dance of the Hours is next, and it has dancing ostriches, elephants, hippos, and crocodiles. It's definitely the most cartoony of the shorts, and has the most slapstick. Then lastly, there's Night on Bald Mountain and Ave Maria. As an adult, Night on Bald Mountain is probably my favorite segment. It has some really cool animation with Chernabog. Apparently, Bela Lugosi was brought in to provide references for the animators, but one animator, Bill Titla, was unhappy with the results, so he had his colleague Wilfred Jackson pose shirtless for the references. Ave Maria ends the entire film being very slow and having a slow fade to black. There are segments in Fantasia that I do get a little bored by, but I can definitely appreciate them. The artistry definitely outweighs everything else. It's a fantastic marriage of music and animation, and it's unfortunate that it wasn't able to hit its stride until much later. Dumbo. Dumbo is the first Disney film to be based on a short children's book, which was actually a very strange one called a roll-a-book, where it was sort of a long panorama consisting of just 8 drawings and little text. The prototype of one of these books was brought to Walt Disney, and Dumbo's story immediately caught his attention, so Walt purchased the rights to it. It was intended to be a short film at first, but decided to make it feature-length to do it justice, though it was designed to be low budget so they could bring in some revenue. Dumbo was basically made to recoup the loss Disney had with Fantasia. Unfortunately, there was a strike during the production of Dumbo. Strikers demanding the studio be unionized with the Screen Cartoonists Guild were actually caricatured as clowns in the film. There's quite a lot to unpack with this strike, and it might be something to visit in a later video. Despite the strike, Dumbo finished production, but RKO didn't like that the film was only 64 minutes. They told Disney to either make it longer, edit it down to a short, or release it as a B-movie. Disney refused all three, and RKO reluctantly released it as an A-movie. It ended up being the most financially successful film of the 1940s for Disney. It cost half as much as Snow White, and grossed $1.6 million on its initial release. Dumbo is a film I would watch a lot as a kid alongside Pinocchio. The baby animals in the beginning are pretty adorable, and so is Dumbo. It's like they tried to make the animation the most adorable thing possible. I found it kind of weird that the train, Casey Jr., is sort of sentient. I mean, I liked it as a kid, because kids love trains. Also, when looking at the world, there's just like a map of Florida, before Disney World was a thing. There's a few antagonizing characters here with the mean old elephants and the abusive kids. That one kid that makes fun of Dumbo should be sent to Pleasure Island in Pinocchio. The character of Timothy O'Mouse started my love for mouse characters, because I always seem to gravitate towards them. The pink elephants on parade is of course a really fun and trippy sequence. There's a lot of bright colors, weird shapes, and just all-out craziness. A lot of people point out the crows in this film as being racist caricatures, but I'd like to point out something else that's kind of odd. The song near the beginning called Song of the Roustabouts. If you really listen to the lyrics, it seems almost more offensive than the crows. After the crows though, there's the climax with Dumbo flying. I just forgot how quickly the movie ends. It's very abrupt. Once he's able to fly, there's only like 4 minutes left in the film. I guess I can understand why, now that I know what was going on behind the scenes. It's still a cute movie that I have fond memories of watching as a kid. Bambi. Bambi is based on a book called Bambi, A Life in the Woods by Felix Salten, which I actually didn't know it was based on a book at all before researching for this video. Apparently, MGM was originally going to adapt the book into a live-action film, but decided it would be too difficult, so they sold the rights to Disney. Funny, because MGM's original plan may come true in the future with the recent Disney remakes. Like I mentioned earlier, Bambi was intended to be the second film, but the animators found it very difficult to animate deer realistically. Deer had been animated before in Snow White, but one animator, Eric Larson, mentioned that they just looked like big flour sacks. They would visit the Los Angeles Zoo for research, then Disney would set up a small zoo at the studio with wildlife that would be featured in the movie. including 2 fawn named Bambi and Faline, so they could study the movement of deer. Due to the financial failure of Pinocchio and Fantasia, Disney was forced to cut 12 minutes from the film to save on production costs. Once again, they lost money at the box office. Bambi received a mixed response from critics, complaining about the lack of fantasy elements that were present in previous films. Hunters also spoke out against the film, saying it was the worst insult offered in any form to American sportsmen in Outdoor Life magazine. Even Walt Disney's daughter complained about the movie, saying that Bambi's mother didn't have to die, and that he could have changed what happened in the book since he's done it before with other films. Ironic, considering people tend to complain about the opposite in regards to Disney films. Even though Bambi had its critics during release, people would love it a lot more as the years went on. This is actually probably my favorite film of this era. I did watch it a lot as a kid, and appreciate the art as an adult. There are so many beautiful backgrounds in Bambi, mostly done by Tyrus Wong, who made them more like impressionistic paintings, having more detail in the center and less around the edges. That way it guides the viewer to the characters. You can definitely tell the animators stared at animals a long time to get the animation right, especially with the deer. They move just like the real thing. I should know, they literally live in my backyard. It's funny that they made 2 movies about baby animals in a row, one about a baby elephant, and now one about a baby deer. Except with Bambi, we get to see him grow up throughout his life. Seasons change, and some major life events happen to him with some time skips in the film. A lot of the movie just seems to be these kid animals playing around, and it can be pretty adorable. One underrated character that I don't see a lot of people talk about is Friend Owl. I think he can be pretty hilarious. His father, the Great Prince of the Forest, is not there for him a lot of the time, but he does help him get out of a fire, which the fire does look really great in this movie. The colors really make you feel like you're watching a forest burn down. Bambi, in my opinion, is probably the most timeless of these films. Since it's about animals, anyone can understand the story without context of the time it was made. I really love how you just don't see humans in the film. Their presence is just heard by gunfire, making it very ominous. Also, Bambi is just cute. Look at him. This era definitely gives me a lot of nostalgic feeling, even though I wasn't around when these films came out. I mean, my parents weren't alive back then either, or even some of my older living relatives. However, I did grow up watching these movies. I remember going to my grandma's house as a kid and watching many of these films on VHS. They definitely have a different aura to them compared to what came after. Perhaps an old-fashioned aura, or maybe just this comfy memory I have of sitting on my grandma's bed and watching them on an old CRT. If you haven't watched these films in a while, it might be worth it to go back and give them a look. The Golden Age films from Disney were just the beginning. Despite some success for Disney, the world wasn't in a good place, and that caused a lot of financial woes. World War II affected a lot of things, including entertainment. I've mentioned how it affected the films after Snow White during this era. But next time, we'll see how it affected Disney for nearly a decade, in the package era. Thank you so much for watching. This is a project I've been wanting to make since like 2016, and I'm finally making it, and I hope you really enjoyed it. And I hope you look forward to the next parts I'm going to be making. I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting me. Your help really means a lot. And I'd like to thank my friends Saber and Jim for proofreading the script of this video, and also to Cosmo, who's made the thumbnails for this series and my thumbnails in general for the past like couple months. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next part. Bye!